Welcome to our series of short videos on international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war. Nations have had customs for conducting war for thousands of years. The Greek city-states forbade warfare when it was time for the Olympic Games. The first caliph of Islam instructed his soldiers to neither kill a child nor a woman nor an aged man. The Second Lateran Council of 1189 prohibited the deadly art of crossbowmen and archers. The practice of using a white flag to request a truce or negotiation began in the 14th century. These and many other customs of warfare were written down and agreed upon by almost every nation on earth in the last half of the 19th century and through the 20th century. These short videos will introduce you to some of today's laws that govern how wars should be conducted and how people surrounded by war should be treated. There are about 200 sovereign states in the world. The possibility of war between sovereign states always exists. Today we see ongoing wars between states as well as many dozens of conflicts within states. In every war, people are killed and injured, communities are displaced, buildings and infrastructure are destroyed, and the environment is damaged. International humanitarian law steps in here. It doesn't stop the wars, but it tries to lessen their devastating effects. A current example of a war between states is the war between Russia and the Ukraine. IHL governs how prisoners of war should be treated and prohibits targeting civilian populations. Despite violations, the framework of IHL provides a language for accountability and a hope for justice after the guns fall silent. The ongoing and devastating civil war in the Sudan is an example of a war within states. International humanitarian law applies to such internal conflicts as well. Wars happen. History shows that humanity has not yet been able to prevent all armed conflict. International humanitarian law exists because, in the face of that reality, we still have a responsibility to limit suffering. This is controversial for some. They argue that regulating war normalizes it, but experience shows that where rules are respected, such as respecting medical transports or avoiding indiscriminate attacks, fewer people suffer. In wars, people are hurt and killed. Buildings and farms are destroyed, roads and factories are damaged, and the natural environment suffers. Populations are displaced, and many are imprisoned. These terrible things happen to people who find themselves in war zones every day. Sadly, nearly half of the deaths directly caused in armed conflict today are innocent civilians rather than those fighting in the conflict. Why, we might ask, do we even need rules for war? The answer is that without limits, wars would be even more destructive. International rules, often in the form of treaties, make certain behaviors illegal, and courts can determine if those rules have been violated. While enforcement is sometimes limited, the very existence of these rules sets important standards for humanity in wartime. The primary reason given for having rules for war is to reduce the suffering caused by war. Some seeing limiting the violence, particularly with respect to the civilian population, as contributing to the conditions where peace can be restored. On the other hand, some cynical voices would say that having rules for war makes certain killing and destruction legal and thus authorized by society. It allows soldiers to kill one another without calling it murder. The rules of war can be divided into two broad categories. The first is jus ad bellum, which refers to the legality of going to war in the first place. This body of law asks, when is it lawful for a state to resort to armed conflict? It covers questions like self-defense, UN Security Council authorization, and prohibitions on aggression. The second category is jus in bello, or international humanitarian law. Jus in bello applies once a conflict has begun and regulates how war is fought. A practical example is the 2003 Iraq War. There was intense debate over jus ad bellum, whether the invasion was legally justified under international law. But regardless of that debate, jus in bello still applied. Coalition forces and Iraqi fighters alike were bound by the Geneva Conventions and prohibited from targeting civilians or mistreating prisoners of war. Treaties between sovereign states make compliance with the rules of war legally binding. These agreements establish obligations, empower courts and tribunals to investigate violations, and sometimes allow for penalties. Even though international enforcement is limited, treaties provide a framework that shapes behavior. The Geneva Conventions are the most widely accepted treaties in history, ratified by nearly every country. This near universality means that when violations occur, states and humanitarian organizations can appeal to a shared legal and moral standard. International humanitarian law, or IHL, is the body of law that regulates armed conflict. It protects people who are not or no longer participating in hostilities, and it restricts the means and methods of warfare to prevent unnecessary suffering. These laws have traditionally been viewed as two separate bodies of law: laws that govern how people are treated, the Geneva Conventions, and laws that govern how war is conducted, the Hague Treaties, and now the additional protocols. IHL applies in both international wars and many internal conflicts. For example, rules on humane treatment apply whether someone is a prisoner of war in a conflict between states or a detainee in a civil war. This breadth makes IHL relevant in nearly all armed conflicts today.